April 17, 1945, somewhere near the Weser River, Germany. The wind carried the cold scent of mud, blood, and gunpowder. The war was crawling to its end, but the dying didn't know that yet. On the western bank of the river, a makeshift American field hospital buzzed with the sounds of groaning men, clattering instruments, and the low murmur of medics fighting time. Captain John R. Matthews, a U.S. Army surgeon with the 45th Infantry Division, hadn't slept in 2 days. His eyes were red, his hands trembling slightly beneath rubber gloves already patched and reused far too many times. The wounded kept coming, Americans, Germans, and civilians alike, all mangled by the same artillery fire. But that morning, as dawn burned weakly through the haze, 2 MPs dragged in a new casualty. He wasn't one of theirs. The man was in a tattered black SS uniform, his insignia half torn off, his face pale as wax. His name tag, barely legible under grime and dried blood, read Obersturmführer Karl Weiss. "Doc, he's bad," one of the MPs muttered, his voice thick with disgust. "Prisoner picked up near the river crossing. Collapsed. We thought he'd been shot, turns out it's something else." Matthews knelt beside the German, his fingers pressing gently against the man's abdomen. The response was instant, a sharp cry of pain. The belly was rigid, the pulse racing. Matthews didn't need long to diagnose it. "Appendicitis," he said quietly. "Advanced. If we don't operate, he'll be dead within the hour." The MPs exchanged glances. "You can't be serious, Captain. We got Yanks out there bleeding to death, and you want to save him?" Matthews didn't answer. His gaze drifted across the tent, to the metal tray where his last set of sterilized instruments lay wrapped in a clean linen sheet. Everything else was gone. Supplies had run out days ago. The war had consumed everything: morphine, gauze, gloves, even soap. The surgeon stood there for a long moment, the distant rumble of artillery filling the silence. The moral weight of his decision pressed on him harder than any battlefield noise ever could. Save the enemy, or hold back the only chance of survival for one of his own men who might arrive in minutes. Matthews swallowed hard and looked down at Weiss again. The SS officer's eyes fluttered open, gray, glassy, and filled not with defiance, but with fear. For the first time, the mask of ideology was gone, and all that remained was a dying man. "Bit," Weiss whispered weakly. "Please." The plea was barely audible, but it was enough. Matthews exhaled slowly and turned toward his nurse, Lieutenant and Foster, who had been standing silently at the edge of the tent. "Prep the table," he said quietly. "We operate." The MPs stared, one shaking his head. "You're wasting your time, document." "Maybe," Matthews replied, voice steady. "But not my humanity." As and began to boil what little water remained, Matthews stripped off his gloves and reached for the linen-wrapped tray. The sterile instruments gleamed faintly in the gray morning light: scalpels, clamps, and scissors, each one a small miracle of cleanliness in a sea of filth. He knew he was gambling everything. But at that moment, on that patch of war-torn soil, an American doctor's oath outweighed his hatred for the uniform before him. As the lamp flickered to life and the instruments were laid out one by one, Matthews took a deep breath, the weight of his choice heavy in the air. The operation, and perhaps his conscience, was about to begin. The tent felt smaller now. The air inside was thick, a mixture of disinfectant, fear, and the faint, metallic scent of blood that clung to every surface. The field hospital's generator coughed weakly, sending a flicker through the single hanging bulb above the operating table. Captain Matthews stood over the unconscious SS officer, his sleeves rolled to his elbows, his forearms trembling with exhaustion. Outside, artillery echoed across the river, a low, rhythmic thunder that reminded everyone that the war was still raging just miles away. "Scalpel," he said quietly. Lieutenant and Foster handed it to him without a word. Her face was pale, lips pressed tightly together. She had treated hundreds of soldiers, friends, brothers, men they'd laughed with over cold rations. But never this. Never a black uniformed Nazi whose comrades had burned villages and executed prisoners. And yet, here they were. Matthews drew in a slow breath, steadying his hand. The moment the blade touched skin, everything else disappeared, the noise, the hatred, the uniforms. It was only flesh, blood, and anatomy now. The work was mechanical, deliberate. His movements had to be exact, there would be no second chance. And dabbed sweat from his forehead. Vitals dropping, she murmured. Matthews didn't look up. Keep him with us. The appendix was inflamed, swollen to the point of rupture. One wrong move and infection would spread through the body, killing the man in hours. Matthews felt the tension in every muscle of his hand. He hadn't eaten in almost a day. His eyes stung from the harsh lantern light. He was running on instinct and duty. Outside, one of the MPs paced angrily, muttering to the other. This is insanity. The guy's SS, for God's sake. How many of our boys did his kind kill? The second guard, older and quieter, just stared through the tent flap. Maybe that's the point, he said softly. Maybe that's what makes us different. Inside, Matthews reached the crucial step. The appendix was removed with a single, careful motion. He could see the faint tear, it would have ruptured any minute. As he sutured the wound, he noticed the tremor in his own fingers, not from fear, but from fatigue and the crushing awareness that this act would not be understood. Anne's voice broke through his thoughts. He's stabilizing. Pulses coming back. Matthews leaned back, exhaling for the first time in what felt like hours. His gloves were slick with sweat and blood. He dropped the final suture and looked down at the now bandaged abdomen. It's done, he said quietly. Silence filled the tent, broken only by the distant rumble of thunder and gunfire. And looked at him, eyes searching. You just saved a man who would have shot you without blinking. Matthews stared at the unconscious officer. Maybe, he said. But I didn't take an oath to decide who deserves to live. He peeled off his gloves slowly, his hands raw and pale beneath. The last sterile instruments lay stained but intact on the tray. There would be no replacements. If another wounded American came in now, he'd have to make do with boiling water and prayer. Still, something in the room had shifted, the line between enemy and human blurred for just a moment. As Matthews stepped outside into the gray light, the MP who'd been pacing glared at him. You think that Kraut's gonna thank you when he wakes up? Matthews looked toward the horizon, smoke curling in the distance where the front line burned. Doesn't matter, he said quietly. I didn't do it for him. The MP scoffed, turning away. But the other guard, the quiet one, simply nodded once, understanding something he couldn't put into words. Inside the tent, the SS officer stirred faintly, his breath shallow but steady. The war outside roared on, but within those thin canvas walls, one act of mercy had defied it. The next morning came cold and gray, the kind of dawn that barely seemed to exist in a war zone. Mist rolled over the ruined fields, and the sound of distant gunfire had faded to a dull, uneasy silence. Inside the medical tent, Captain Matthews sat on a wooden stool beside the cot where Obersturmführer Karl Weiss lay. The man's breathing was shallow but steady. His uniform had been cut away during surgery, leaving him wrapped in a coarse army blanket. His face was pale, streaked with sweat, but the fever had broken. Matthews rubbed his tired eyes, staring at the notes scrawled in his field log: blood pressure, heart rate, temperature. The handwriting had begun to slant from exhaustion. And Foster approached quietly, holding a tin mug of coffee that smelled like burnt earth. You should sleep, she said softly. He gave a faint smile. After the next war. She hesitated, glancing at Weiss. They're asking what to do with him. Command wants him transferred to the POW holding area when he's stable. Matthews nodded absently. He's still critical. Moving him now would kill him. Before and could reply, Weiss stirred, a faint groan escaping his lips. His eyes fluttered open, gray and clouded. For a moment, confusion twisted across his face as he looked around the tent. He tried to sit up, but pain shot through his abdomen, forcing him back down. Matthews leaned forward. Lie still. You've just had surgery. Weiss blinked, his gaze struggling to focus on the man beside him. When he finally recognized the uniform, olive drab, the silver caduceus pinned to the collar, his expression shifted. Shock. Then disbelief. American, he rasped. Matthews nodded once. You were lucky. Appendicitis. It nearly killed you. For a long moment, Weiss just stared at him, as if trying to understand the absurdity of what had happened. His hand trembled as he reached toward his bandaged side. You operated? I did. The German's lips parted, but no words came. His eyes moved to the instruments on the nearby tray, washed, reused, gleaming faintly in the dim light. Then to Matthews's face, lined with fatigue and something harder to define, decency. Weiss swallowed, his voice breaking. Why? The question hung in the air. Matthews didn't look at him right away. He picked up his stethoscope, pressing it lightly to the man's chest. Because you were dying, he said simply. But I'm your enemy. Matthews met his gaze then, steady and unflinching. Out there, yes, he said quietly, nodding toward the distant gunfire. In here, you're a patient. Weiss turned his head slightly, staring at the tent flap as if he could see the war beyond it. The word seemed to unsettle him more than any battlefield could. He had been raised on orders, obedience, and hatred, a machine built for a cause now dying under its own weight. And yet this man, this enemy, had risked his only sterile tools to save him. I don't understand, Weiss whispered. Matthews gave a faint, tired smile. You don't have to. For a long while, the two men sat in silence, doctor and soldier, captor and captive, separated by everything war had built and united by what little of humanity remained. When Anne stepped back into the tent, she found Matthews still sitting there, watching over his patient like any other wounded man. Weiss had fallen asleep again, his face peaceful for the first time in years. She spoke quietly. You know what the men are saying? Matthews didn't look up. I can imagine. They say you wasted your tools. That you saved the wrong man. He nodded slowly. Maybe. But when this war ends, and it will end, I'd rather remember saving one life than choosing who didn't deserve it. Outside, the wind stirred the torn canvas of the tent. The sound of distant artillery had stopped entirely now. Somewhere beyond the river, surrender was spreading through the German lines. But inside this small patch of canvas and mud, something else had already surrendered, the hate that kept men divided. 2 days later, the rain came, steady, cold, and relentless. It hammered on the canvas roofs of the field tents, turning the camp's dirt paths into rivers of brown sludge. The war was nearly over, everyone could feel it. German resistance was collapsing, towns were surrendering by the hour, and rumors of Hitler's bunker spread like wildfire through the ranks. But even with victory close at hand, there was no celebration here, only fatigue. Inside the medical tent, Captain Matthews checked on his patients, one by one. Gunshot wounds, shrapnel tears, fevers, they were all blurring together. Yet every time his eyes landed on the SS officer lying quietly in the corner cot, a ripple of unease moved through the room. The other wounded men avoided looking at him. Some turned away outright. Whispers had started, quiet, bitter ones. That's the guy the doc saved. An SS officer, can you believe that? He probably killed Americans 2 weeks ago. Matthews heard them all but said nothing. He knew that no amount of explanation could make sense of what he'd done, not to soldiers who had lost friends to the cruelty of men in that same black uniform. Lieutenant and Foster approached with a clipboard. Her expression was guarded. "Command's been asking about him again. They want him transferred to the POW camp at Göttingen as soon as he's fit to travel." Matthews nodded without looking up. "Another day or two?" And hesitated. "They also want an account, your justification for using sterile equipment on an enemy combatant." That made him stop. He looked up, weary but calm. "Justification?" "Orders," she said softly. "They need it for the report." He gave a bitter laugh. "I used a scalpel, not a rifle." "Since when does saving a life require justification?" And didn't respond. She didn't need to. They both knew how bureaucracy worked, even in war. As she walked away, Matthews sat down at his desk, a rough plank balanced over 2 ammo crates, and pulled out his field log. The paper was damp, edges curled from humidity. He began to write, the pencil dragging slowly across the page. April 20, 1945. Performed emergency appendectomy on German POW, identified as SS Obersturmführer Karl Weiss. Decision made due to imminent threat to life. No alternative instruments available. Chose to proceed per medical oath. He paused, staring at the last line. Then, after a moment's thought, he added. The distinction between enemy and human ends at the operating table. He closed the log and sat back, the exhaustion finally sinking into his bones. Outside, through the tent flap, he could see Weiss sitting upright now, staring at the rain. The German officer's face was gaunt, his eyes hollow but alive. When Matthews approached, Weiss looked up. "Your men, they don't want me here," he said quietly, his English surprisingly clear. "They don't have to want you here," Matthews replied. "They just have to let you live." Weiss nodded slowly, glancing down at his trembling hands. "I was told Americans would never show mercy. That you would shoot men like me without hesitation." Matthews folded his arms, rain dripping off his sleeves. "You were told a lot of things." A silence hung between them. Outside, trucks rumbled by, new arrivals, new prisoners, new wounded. Finally, Weiss spoke again, his voice low. "Back home, my father was a doctor. He taught me the Hippocratic Oath before I ever wore this uniform. First, do no harm." He gave a faint, bitter smile. "And yet I did. I believed in something that destroyed everything it touched." Matthews studied him, unsure whether to feel pity or disgust. "Then maybe start believing in something else," he said finally. Weiss looked up, meeting his eyes. "Do you believe this war can ever end?" "Not on paper, in men's hearts." Matthews sighed, glancing toward the rain-soaked horizon. "Not soon," he said. "But maybe it starts with one person refusing to hate another, even for a moment." The German nodded slowly, his gaze distant. "Then maybe it started here." For a brief second, there was understanding, not forgiveness, not friendship, but something quieter and more fragile. When Matthews stepped back out into the rain, the distant sound of artillery had gone completely silent. The war was ending. But he knew the memory of what he'd done, and what it meant, would follow him far longer than the sound of guns. April 30, 1945, near Göttingen, Germany. The rain had finally stopped. The sky hung low and gray, and the roads were lined with surrendering German soldiers, their weapons piled in neat rows, helmets resting atop rifles like gravestones for a dead cause. Trucks groaned through the mud, carrying prisoners of war toward makeshift holding camps that had sprung up across the countryside. Captain John Matthews stood by one such truck, his medical satchel slung across his shoulder. Inside the back, among dozens of weary prisoners, sat Obersturmführer Karl Weiss, his arms still weak, his abdomen bandaged. He looked nothing like the confident officer who had once commanded men under the banner of the Reich. His uniform was stripped of insignia, his face hollowed by pain and quiet shame. Matthews climbed up, handing a small envelope to the guard in charge. "Give this to the command at the Göttingen camp," he said. "It's his medical clearance. No heavy labor until he's fully recovered." The guard glanced at him, surprised, maybe even a little skeptical. "You sure, Captain? After all, he's SS." Matthews nodded. "He's also my patient." The guard shrugged and took the papers, climbing into the driver's seat. As the engine coughed to life, Weiss caught Matthews's eye. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Weiss reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, folded slip of paper. He held it out with a trembling hand. "For you," he said in halting English. Matthews hesitated, then took it. Weiss's eyes met his, gray, tired, but steady. "If I live to see peace," the German said, his voice barely audible over the growl of the engine, "I will remember that not all enemies were monsters." Matthews gave a faint nod. "And not all monsters were beyond saving." The truck pulled away, the prisoners silent as it disappeared down the winding dirt road. The sound of the engine faded into the distance until only the wind remained. Matthews unfolded the slip of paper. Inside, written in uneven English, were just a few words. "Compassion is the last victory of the human soul." He stood there for a long time, the paper trembling slightly between his fingers. The war around him was ending, Hitler dead, the Reich collapsing, the Allies closing in from every direction. The victory the world had waited for was finally here. But in Matthews's mind, the images of war, the blood, the cries, the endless stream of broken bodies, didn't fade. Only that single moment in the tent stayed sharp and clear, the sound of his scalpel, the heartbeat of a dying man, and the quiet choice to save instead of destroy. Later that evening, Matthews returned to his tent to finish his field report. He wrote the final entry with slow, deliberate strokes. April 30, 1945. War ending across Europe. Performed final transfer of German POW, Obersturmführer Karl Weiss. Patient stable. No complications. Reflecting tonight on the cost of compassion, not measured in supplies or orders, but in understanding. The enemy we fight on the battlefield is easier than the one inside ourselves. He closed the log, sealing it with a trembling hand. Outside, in the fading light, he could hear soldiers laughing for the first time in months, their voices raw and uncertain. And Foster appeared at the tent flap, holding a folded newspaper just arrived from headquarters. "It's over," she said quietly. "Berlin's fallen. Hitler's dead." Matthews looked up, his expression unreadable. "So it's over," he echoed. Then, after a moment, "for some of us." He reached into his pocket and touched the folded note again, Weiss's words echoing in his mind. When the war finally went silent that night, Captain John Matthews didn't celebrate. He simply sat under the dim lantern light, staring at the instruments that had saved both an enemy's life and, perhaps, his own sense of humanity. Because in the chaos and cruelty of war, it wasn't the battles that defined men, it was the choices made when no one was watching. And on that gray April morning, a tired American doctor had chosen mercy over vengeance. It didn't win him a medal. It didn't change the outcome of the war. But it reminded him, and maybe one enemy officer, that even in the darkest times, the smallest act of compassion could be the brightest victory of all.